At its very core, drug science must remain independent. This means we don't accept sponsorships. It's with the support of the drug science community we're able to do this and make the podcast in the first place. If you're able to become a drug science community member and support the show, you too will be supporting the dissemination of evidence-based drug policies. Without you, none of this would be possible. For anybody interested, there's a link in the show notes. Thank you. Hello and welcome to the Drug Science Podcast with me, David Nutt. Here we're bringing together experts and activists for a rational, honest and informed conversation about drugs.
Well, hello and welcome everyone to this new year, the 1st of the 1st, 2025, the first podcast of 25 and a rather different podcast because today we are talking with our community members, the people that effectively keep drug science afloat through their very kind and generous monthly donations. It's an Ask Dave Anything session. I'm hoping most of the questions will relate to things that drug science do rather than my body weight or my cholesterol, because I see we've got at least one doctor on the call, and a pharmacist who might want to talk to me about my drug interactions. And I'm not yet sure what Raj does, and he'll tell us shortly. But welcome the three of you, and hopefully others will join. But the floor is yours for the next 50 minutes or so to ask me anything. And thanks again for your support. So I think, Andrew, you were going to kick off, weren't you?
Thank you. I'm a cannabis prescriber interested in psychedelic-assisted therapy. I'm just curious why, since cannabis can be used as a psychedelic, why it isn't being used more widely in the UK as a legal route for psychedelic therapy.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question. And I think the answer is I don't know. I suspect not many people have thought about it. But you are not alone. There is an Australian I met when I was in Oz trying to help them get their regulations changed so they could prescribe psilocybin and MDMA, who was at several of my talks. And he's very interested in the idea that you could use quite a zap of THC to produce a powerfully psychedelic transcendental state, which might actually work in a similar way to psychedelics. And I encourage him to pursue that approach because, again, as here in Australia, cannabis is available as a medicine. And I know he has been continuing to do some clinical work with that. I don't think he's actually published anything, but I think he is trying to collate the data. The observations I would make, though, are that it isn't the same. So THC is obviously a powerfully psychoactive drug. Some of you may have read about 15 years ago, Robin Carr Harris and I did a kind of comparison of the experiences of three possible psychedelics. We compared psilocybin with ketamine and with THC. And we came to the conclusion that the most psychedelic, psychomimetic was actually psilocybin, and then followed by ketamine, and then followed by cannabis. And subsequent brain imaging studies have supported that. Psilocybin, ketamine and other serotonergic psychedelics, they produce this profound desynchronization of brain activity, which we call the entropic brain state, and which we think is at least one factor in the therapeutic outcome. We think that particular state of fragmenting entrenched rhythmic activity of the brain actually leads people to begin to escape or break free from repetitive ruminations. Now, THC doesn't do that. The EEG under THC is actually quite different. And so whether it would have the same impact on connectivity and disruption of connectivity is a bit less clear. I mean, I think it's a good idea, and I certainly think there would be potential in it. And I guess the point you're making is if you haven't got anything else, it's not a bad place to start. I suppose the question I would ask you is, why wouldn't you use ketamine instead? Because that's where we've gone. As some of you may know, we set up two ketamine clinics. They've sadly gone bust because the NHS wouldn't buy into them. But we found that ketamine was quite a useful proxy for psilocybin, and wasn't easy to use because it's still a controlled drug, but at least it was a prescribable drug as opposed to a Schedule I research drug, which psilocybin is. So is that a fair question to ask you, why you would prefer THC to
Yeah, no, it is a fair question. I've done some ketamine training as well. I think probably my initial thought, because I'm relatively new to this area, the last year or two, my initial thought was that cannabis is less risky for participants. My observation on the people under ketamine, and indeed, I was having legal ketamine when I went to do training on it. Then my experience was of being completely unconscious for a period, and other people were as well. So the kind of risks associated with ketamine were significantly more. I think you probably do need the two therapists there at the same time for protection of everyone. And, the fact that there were only a couple of ketamine clinics that I knew of privately, and so far as I know, they've both gone bust. There's one NHS ketamine clinic I visited, but they don't provide any therapy alongside it.
That was the Oxford one. Yes, that's McShane, I guess. Yes.
Yeah, and great service, but it's come from a very medical model alongside ECT, etc. Yeah, whereas cannabis, like breath work, which I'm also interested in, cannabis you can step out of if people are having a very difficult time. They're more able to titrate the dose rather than, ketamine, which a bit like psilocybin can be an all or nothing thing. So I think probably starting from the kind of gentler, safer end and potentially adding in breath work as well, which by itself can lead to people having quite into psychedelic-like journeys. So yeah, start with something that is already legal and very widespread. So there are a lot of cannabis clinics, a lot of people, as you know, who are now using cannabis through those clinics compared to ketamine, which has, a number of difficulties.
No, there is no doubt that's true. I think probably about 60,000 people in the UK now getting prescribed medical cannabis, and 5 are on the NHS, which is outrageous. But most of them are using it very differently. And I think your model is still quite a challenging thing to do for a number of reasons. I mean, actually working out what the right dose of THC is for any individual, we have found to be quite difficult. So I just wondered how you would deal with that question. Well, that's the first thing. And the second thing is, of course, a big dose of THC will put you in a very strange state for a long time. It clears much more slowly from the brain than ketamine and psilocybin. So you might well run into problems of whether people are allowed to get, if you're doing it in the daytime, allowing people to go home, because it might be that they're stoned for quite a few hours after a dose.
Yep, okay. So first question about dose, then I would say it is easier to titrate, at least with cannabis. So bearing in mind, like ketamine, that you don't necessarily have to get the dose right first time. In a trial, you have to specify the dose, obviously for, trial reasons. So it can be replicable, etc. Whereas, in a non-trial setting, obviously you can titrate 1 week. You can find a dose that's acceptable. You can gradually increase the following week. However, if you're going to do it in one go, then if the peak concentration from THC, maybe within minutes rather than hours.
Well, that is true. So, but hang on, you haven't explained to us how you're going to give it.
Oh, vaping flower.
Oh, in as one would if one was using it therapy for pain, for instance. Yeah, I see. So vape the flower, get a powerful
vaping. Firstly, because it's very bioavailable. I'm telling you things you know.
No, but listen, you're not. This conversation is for the audience. It's not for you and me, really. So they may not know that. That's an interesting approach here. So we certainly use in our imaging work on cannabis. We've used the volcano, which is a kind of free vapor, a balloon you blow up with a certain amount of THC or CBD or both in them, and get them to breathe, inhale the whole lot. And that's relatively easy to guarantee what people have got. The problem is when we found that people could tolerate a lot less than they thought they could. So they tended not to to actually empty the whole bag, because they became very, very high, very, very fast. But we haven't ever done any experimental work with those sort of handheld flower vapors that people use therapeutically. Now that's actually a really interesting idea. Thank you for that. And are you saying that you, as a therapist, then you bring someone in for a session and then start with I don't actually know how you titrate the dose. Is it the amount of flower you put in, or the amount of volts you put through it, or what? Explain that to me.
Well, if you use the example of the volcano in the bag, as you've described, then it's up to you how many inhalations you take from the bag. So you can take an inhalation and you can wait for a couple of minutes. You can take another.
Okay, right. So basically, the flour's in the pot, it's heated, and you inhale and inhale. You suggest that your patient would inhale and inhale and inhale until they got quite dissociated. They got quite high. That was what you'd target a state of dissociation, would you?
Yeah, no, I believe so.
Okay.
Yeah. But that allows your
Yeah.
comment about people responding to different levels of THC very differently.
That's a really clever idea.
Titrated on an individual basis.
I like that, Andrew. I think I would definitely encourage you to do that. Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting question as to whether that fits within the current regulatory status of cannabis, but I think you could argue it does, because you're doing it in a sensible way. People are doing what they're doing anyway for pain, and why shouldn't you use it for therapy? I think that's that's clever, and I would like you to come back in a year's time and tell me how it's gone, because I mean, historically, there's an enormous amount of literature on the sort of insights and experiences that people get when they are actually more when they're coming down from being stoned rather than being stoned. And I don't know if you read the Mike J's new book called Psychonauts.
I haven't, no.
So you'll love it, because there's a massive chapter on the technology and the technique of using cannabis. It was pioneered by artists, philosophers, doctors in France in the sort of in the 1850s, where they were interested in the question. They seem to have been basically looking back at the old Arab literature. There are two phases to the impact of cannabis. There's the stoning phase, and then there's the insight phase afterwards, which comes on quite a few hours after you've gone through what for some people can be quite an unpleasant stoning experience. But then you get into a state where you can, which is a little bit transcendent, a little bit like you might get with, say, psilocybin. So I would read that as well, and maybe that will help you work out exactly when you want to intervene with your psychotherapeutic wisdom optimally. So yeah, actually, clever idea. I thank you for. Is it pure THC flower you're using, or do you try to mix it with CBD flower as well?
I haven't tried mixing it with CBD flower, no. There's a couple of people that I've learned of. So there's a Canadian chap who's doing this, combining it with breath work as well. And he learned from a chap called Daniel McQueen, who has published a book called Psychedelic Cannabis. And this, I think, was published in 2019, perhaps.
Right.
So this has been around a little while. And he also combines, well, he either does cannabis breathwork, or he combines it with breathwork. Cannabis journeys rather, or with breathwork. But with regard to CBD, these people recommend is having CBD as a kind of rescue medication, in the same way that I think some people do through cannabis clinics for people who have a adverse reaction with anxiety. So they would actually sort of vape CBD and have that as a standby. Yeah.
That makes a lot of sense. You may know, in the psychedelic center at Imperial, there's another doctor alongside me called David Arizzo, and he's just come back from Australia. He's been training Australian psychiatrists to be ready or to take advantage of the fact that they now have access to psilocybin and MDMA for treatment-resistant depression and PTSD, respectively. But in order to get approval to use those medicines in Australia, they have to apply to an ethics committee, and they have to demonstrate a level of competence and experience. And they're not allowed to take MDMA or psilocybin. So David was telling me this afternoon, they had the training sessions where they really deeply engaged in holotropic breathwork and found it, as you pointed out, extremely powerful, fast acting, and people get into a very strange, different state within minutes. And obviously, Stan Groff has been using it for 50 years. So resurrecting it. But I don't think the Aussies have ever thought about trying to use cannabis to facilitate it. That's a really interesting thought. And I will share that thought with him, because they've got medical cannabis in Australia, the same as we have here. So it might well be worth. And actually, you've excited me even more now, because one of the things that drug science is hoping to do, if we get funding, and we've applied for a grant from a a Swedish charity, we would like to set up a training course in the UK so that at some point in the not too distant future, we do have a cohort of doctors and other therapists trained with some experience, such as breathwork or possibly going overseas. But if it had to be done in the UK, breathwork would be the easiest thing to do. And the idea of actually facilitating that with cannabis is actually rather exciting. Maybe we'll bring you in as a therapist.
Delighted. Thank you.
Okay, I think Raj, we better come to you now. Otherwise, it'll be too much of a
Thank you. Yeah. No, so, David, we've met many times actually in Parliament and the Awakened on the opening day, and so I'm a psychiatrist and a medical psychotherapist. But I was a medical student when you were at Imperial doing your research, and I suppose that I've been kind of open to this for many years, and all the kind of conferences and breaking conventions and all the great and the good, and there's so many doing so many things everywhere. And I suppose I was saying to James and to Andrew and to Neve a little bit about like being here feels like a holding pen. And, you know, in the books that you shared, you signed and you gave to us as copies, you've obviously had skin in the game for such a long time, really, like, and put yourself out there with, you know, activists on many different fronts to kind of pioneer great work. Now, how do you tolerate all your years of service, you know, pioneering, the papers you write, the perspective that you've been given and taken, the positions that you've had in the government that have been given and then pulled away? How do you tolerate that we are sitting on something so powerful, so special, and yet only certain deserving people are allowed to do this? And even, you know, it's almost like, how would you sell going to space if you've not yet been? How would you sell going to Brazil if you've not yet been? You know, like you said, the Australian doctors have to be shamed. No, you can't take this, but okay, yes, the PTSD patient can. When actually we're thinking these things could be really helpful. There's obviously a lot of anecdotal evidence that's now moved into the scientific space.
Yep.
And yet we are still talking about shame and guilt and embarrassment and taboo. And it has to be underground and illicit. When most people are saying, and the books are being written, this is transformative. This is actually so beautiful, potentially. Why do we have to hide this under a rock?
Well, it's a very good question. I think there are several aspects. I'd answer it with different. I give you a series of different small answers. I mean, the first is, in the 60s, there was an attempt to actually make it very, very widely available. And that did rather rebound. Now, you might say, well, society wasn't ready for it then. And it got really messed up with the anti-Vietnam War movement and got vilified because of that. So maybe modern society is better and more open-minded and could accept the idea of sort of cognitive liberty. You might be right. I don't know. And whilst we don't know, that's quite a risky path to tread, I think. And I don't mind. I'm certainly happy that states like Oregon and Colorado have now made mushrooms available for well-being. I think that's actually fantastic, because we will gradually, I'm sure, collate data to reinforce your view and my view that these are safe and will almost certainly improve well-being and will essentially, you know, improves many aspects of people's lives and also therefore improve society. I'm very happy that is happening, but there's a limit to what I can champion. And as a psychiatrist and a sort of neuroscientist, I've stuck to what I can be absolutely sure about, which is the science of these drugs. And I think, I hope, maybe I'm wrong. You can let me know what you think. I think one of the reasons we are as far forward as we are now is because the science has become very clear. It's accumulated. And yes, okay, it's focused largely on treating illness. But even in those studies of treating illness, we find people do have improved well-being. We've also reported, and that's actually one of the reasons we got quite interested in treating illness, was in our studies of healthy volunteers, that there were clearly positive effects on perception and connection with the world, you know, for people who didn't have a mental illness. So, you know, there's a gradual accumulation of evidence to support the idea that these can be, you know, these medicines, these drugs can definitely put people's minds, brains into a better place. And we can't be accused of simply encouraging people to do something without knowing what the risks are, because we now know the last 20 years of doing experiments with psilocybin and MDMA. I was thinking about this just yesterday. There must be several thousand humans that have been studied in detail with both these drugs, and there's almost no evidence of any harm. So in the modern era, we can say we've actually kind of proved they're safe by doing science. And that should be quite reassuring to regulators and the Home Office, etc. So I think the progress has not been as fast as you might like, but you're in a very fortunate position because you're very young. I have little doubt when you get to my age, things will be very different. But I am worried. I am still worried about a possible backlash. Strange things happen. I mean, the American election was rather odd. It's completely impossible to know what America is going to do. I mean, because the person at charge doesn't know what he's going to do. So how can anyone know what's going to happen? So it's not absolutely certain that we will continue to progress in a sort of logical fashion. And I don't think there's any doubt that the strongest case we can make is that there are people who need these medicines and who've been denied them. And so for those of you who don't know, there are a group of us getting together, an alliance called the Manifesto Alliance, which is going to put together what we think will be an unassailable case for making psilocybin and MDMA medicines like in Australia, to do what we did in Australia, which is essentially go to the government with a body of evidence of safety and efficacy and say, you have got to put patients first now. We cannot wait. We should not wait until a drug company, American company, goes through the machinations of the FDA, who seem hostile to these drugs anyway, in order to be able to sell these drugs in America. That shouldn't be what determines our decision-making. We should do what the Australians did and look at the evidence, accept that the evidence is strong, in the same way as Sally Davis, the chief medical officer, accepted that the medical cannabis evidence was good enough to reschedule cannabis without any company asking for it to happen. And we should do the same with psilocybin and MDMA. And we should use charities like they did in Australia to get licenses to access and import the medicines, or we could even do it ourselves and then make it available. And to do that, we will have to reassure organizations like the Royal College of Psychiatrists that there are enough trained individuals to, who can supervise the sorts of sessions we'll need. And that's, one of the reasons why, Drug Science is setting up this training course and has already had that short course just before Christmas. But I think that way, once we've rescheduled, then we're in a much stronger position to get more and more people understanding the value. And I will share with you, Raj, from your perspective, it's, you've obviously been taught by us, you've followed what we do. You're an enthusiast. You're on this program. You're definitely an enthusiast. But we've started doing, one of our PhD students, I was talking with her just this morning, she started doing focus groups with doctors and other therapists to find out what their attitude is to psychedelics. And she's discovering that many of them are utterly ignorant, and some are still hostile. Some still believe the lies that they've been told, through their medical careers by the Home Office, by the Department of Health, about the danger of these drugs. So there's still a big body of ignorance out there, and we don't want that suddenly swinging back as a pendulum and knocking us over. So I think edging into medicine, the public, by and large, we estimate that 60% of the public are in favor of rescheduling because they would trust us to do it. And they see that, the medicines and the therapies you have at present aren't good enough. But I think it's less clear with doctors. And I do find that a bit disturbing. So, and doctors, you've seen with the assisted dying bill, doctors are a strange bunch. Many of them don't think like us, which I find odd, but there's still a lot of work to be done because some of them are not just strange. They can also, they're hugely influential. You just need one or two doctors standing up and saying, this is outrageous. And people are going to suffer as a result of this, and get a politician to use that, and that would be a sort of a flag for a politician. And we would be fighting very, very, a much tougher battle than we need to. And I'll give you an example of that in Australia. So you may not know this, but all the states have now agreed with their Therapeutic Drugs Administration, the TGA. They've all agreed that they should reschedule, and they all have. But one state, New South Wales, insists that these drugs are too dangerous to be used in outpatient clinics. They have to be used in a hospital. And that is because their chief psychiatrist is extremely anti these drugs. He's part of the historical enmity to them. And he has a lot of power. And there's a legal challenge going on, which I'm party to try to get, that's New South Wales, to change his attitude. We haven't won it yet. Hopefully we will win. But I'm just sharing that with you even when regulators come to a sensible decision, the medical profession is, quite capable of making things difficult. So
yeah, there's a lot you shared there. And I think, like you said, your kind of activism and the evidence base and allowing that to sing. And it has taken time. And, MAPS, Rick Doblin has been pioneering all that. And there was this hope and the Holy Grail land that, 2024 would be a year that MDMA would be possible for PTSD war veterans, and things are slow. And like you said, look, the evolving change all the time. The clouds always seeming to come over the light. But the light has been winning out. And I think, there's so many scientific perspective, the ethnobotanist perspective, the evolutionary perspective, the wide perspective of actually how we co-evolved with all these things. Now,
yes, there are many different arguments, and each one chips away at the prejudice, doesn't it? I mean, yes, MAPS, the FDA MAPS decision on PTSD was extremely disappointing. I thought it was actually outrageous the way the FDA almost set out to undermine it from the very first comment in the hearing. But over the last 2 years, there's been discussions going on with the European Medicines Agency, and the EMA want these medicines. There's no doubt they want them because they think, quite rightly, European citizens have a right to have access to medicines in the same way as Australians do, and in the same way as Americans would if MDMA was approved in America. And they were very angry that MAPS, Lycos, stopped doing studies in Europe and said they couldn't afford to go through the European registration process. So I don't know if you know this, but a couple of years ago, the activists in the Netherlands that had the ear of the government got a government commission set up, headed by a QC, the equivalent of a QC, and they did a very detailed assessment of MDMA as a therapy. And they came to exactly the same conclusions as the Australian regulators, that MDMA is clearly a medicine. You've got thousands of patients that have been treated with MDMA effectively, safely. You've also got millions of people using it safely, recreationally. And they are in the process of trying to work out how they can facilitate access in the Netherlands, despite MAPS and Lycos. And they can do it. They could actually do exactly what the Australians did. They won't. I think they're going to be more cautious. I think what they are likely to do is fund a major naturalistic study across the Netherlands for people with chronic trauma, and buy in or make the medicine anyway. It's not difficult to make. They could make it in the Netherlands. It's not patentable, and then they could actually go it alone, like Australia is doing. And I'm encouraging them. I gave evidence to that particular committee, and we could support them. And actually, if they would do that, I think I'd make a strong case to the UK Department of Health for us to do something in parallel, maybe with the same medicine, with the same outcomes and the same therapy. So yes, it's not exactly where we wanted to be, but if you ask me why I'm still going, it's because we're so much further along than when I started. We've got many.
Then it's important, David. Then it's important to think about your weight and your cholesterol, because you still need it in the fight. And
thank you.
And yeah, you absolutely. And look, and David, I think we were talking about cannabis, and I think the important thing, whatever the molecule, I think the molecule allowing for the peak experience. And we have to be in a society and in a way of learning and developing where we can nurture the peak experience, the transcendent experience. I think that's the most cataclysmic experience that these psychedelics can offer. And there's a lot of work that we need to be doing on that on an individual level and a societal level. And I think the people that hold the evolutionary knowledge will be able to share their bits. Those that have been under the radar, maintaining their own renaissance, doing their own self-practice, tolerating the shame, working through it, offering these medicines to people in illicit underground ways. Our community is in the scientific and medical also needs to embrace the fact that there's a lot of knowledge held everywhere. And look, with you and your credibility, you can be that you're at the vanguard of collating all of that and being the bastion, because you've tolerated all the sledging. When many would turn back the amount that you've endured, David.
Yes. Well, yes. Luckily, I got thick skin, but again, I think it's quite easy to suffer abuse when you know you're right. And I just want to say another thing. I think I'm very sympathetic to what you said about the peak experience. So I have just last week given 3 lectures in 3 different countries on psychedelics in medicine, and every time I give a lecture, people say, "Well, can we get the effect without the experience?" And that is being driven now by this slightly bizarre idea that American, I suppose what you call, biochemists, pharmacologists have been developing to try to persuade American investors to invest in non-psychedelic psychedelics that will give the benefits of a psychedelic without the trip. And they've done that for commercial reasons, and also to try to avoid the drugs that they're making being controlled as Schedule 1 drugs because they're psychedelic. And to my mind, this is utterly bizarre because I cannot see how a non-psychedelic psychedelic is going to suddenly change your mind if you don't even know you've taken it. So, I don't know what they're expecting to happen. And at the very best, I think these drugs will end up like SSRIs. You'll just take them every day for eternity, and they will protect you, perhaps give you resilience, maybe slowly allow you to come out of depression. I'm continually showing data from both of our trials, which showed clearly that the magnitude of the experience, but particularly the nature of the experience, the transcendental nature of the experience is predictive of outcome. So why would you not want that, other than because you are trying to comply with a regulatory system which is just so backward it doesn't even understand the science? But anyway, that's enough of me rabbiting on. What about you, Niamh? What did you want to say? Bring your pharmaceutical in here.
Well, I'm actually going to just take it back a step to comment that Raj made about, well, you both were discussing the sad outcome of the FDA's decision not to approve MDMA this summer. And I still have this theory that the FDA and maybe other regulatory authorities, I don't know what the MHRA are like, just have not got the mechanism and the expertise to assess the assisted therapy side of these medicines, which of course is critical and was critical to the whole trial. So we need to kind of move that bit forward. And I don't know if you know of any programs emerging. I think Drug Science are now doing something in that direction, because there is nothing regulated in that space yet. And if I kind of did a bit of a dive into the reasons that the FDA didn't approve MDMA, and a lot of it, I think, was, well, they didn't have the expertise on the panel. They didn't have the right people.
Well, they chose it. They chose exactly the wrong people.
Well, exactly, Dave. But they didn't 100%. But they're not set up. They're just not geared up to assess the psychotherapeutic side of this. And of course, somebody just taking a dose of MDMA might be dissociative, but it's not going to fix their PTSD. They need. Sorry, Raj, you disagree with that? Do you?
Well, I completely agree. Absolutely. This is a shame.
Are you shaking your head just there?
No. I'm I'm solidarity. Absolutely.
Okay. Yeah. But do you not think that's the problem? That's, so we're kind of ahead of the curve and the regulatory authorities just haven't got there yet.
No. And look, and there's also there's this mentoring aspect in life. Like, David mentor here, even though very few times I met him, how people live their life, how people show you it. This is where the knowledge needs to be passed down. And there are people that have such wealth They haven't done it in a medical space. They've done it 10,000 times in every other space and done lots of healing.
Indeed.
And they have a lot of knowledge. And to be fair, this is something called esoteric knowledge held by a few people. Occult, also the same. The words have been adulterated to look and like something horrible. And this medicine. This is medicine. It's been adulterated to look like something like sin. And David wrote those papers, and there's ripples in the pond, and they're very important ripples. I want tsunamis. I really do.
I'm with you there, but let's just go back to where we are at present. So the reality is, I'm skeptical that the current regulatory system will allow this for a variety of reasons, and therefore, I actually think trying to twist what we do to comply with it is just stupid. Because in the end, they hold all the cards. So why don't we just say these aren't going to be licensed in the same way as you license SSRIs or you license antipsychotics? These are different medicines. And let's have a much more open dialogue about how we can maximize their value when they're available. And don't rely on companies making profits. Do what Australia did. Get charities to provide them. It's not the first time in history that medicines have been made available without profit. Certainly, if that's the only way, let's do it. Or let's do experiments. Let's do that here and see how we get on.
What's that roadmap then, David?
That roadmap is to have a sort of naturalistic trial done in Britain, and that's something drug science is going to work towards. We would like to set up essentially a real world evidence trial of psilocybin and MDMA along the lines of what we did with T21 with cannabis. Make it available, but from companies that aren't going to hang the patent, aren't going to try to make money to make it, but who will cover their own costs, but make the medicine available, and allow psychiatrists and other therapists to work together to work out how best to use these in the real world, in a variety of disorders, and with a variety of different support systems, psychotherapy systems, what you will, and maybe doing it in some of them doing it in group therapy as well. So building a sort of ecosystem of using these rather than a simple RCT, which essentially reflects people who don't exist in much of the real world anyway, and is hugely expensive and very often flawed. So that's something that's on very much one of our ambitions over the next year, is to try to build a vision of a different way of bringing these medicines into medicine with measured outcomes, so that we can eventually convince everyone that they're as good as we think they are.
Yeah, no, I think where the conversation's going, just kind of a thought coming to mind. And obviously we're talking a bit about the scientific endeavor here. And then obviously your kind of psychoeducational route with drug sciences, and then the advocacy route that you take as well. Yes. Now, I think people are doing these things. We know in consensus, we know in the census data that the numbers are large for lots of different things. And you've spent work in the addiction space, and I've conceptualized it into this kind of idea. Like, what does it tell us? Our need for diazepam, cocaine, and heroin. Diazepam, really powerful anxiolytic, man's desire to run away from fear. Okay. What about heroin? Man's desire to run away from pain. Yeah. What about cocaine? Man's desire to run towards reward. Psychedelics, they are learning tools. People go, they're not filling their boots with it. They're like, wow, that was powerful. Okay, got to learn how to be a better human being. Got to learn how to be a better social being. I could do better, and hopefully, bringing ecological awareness, social awareness, interconnectivity, healing of trauma and past relationships, a desire to want to actualize. And even like in Maslow, unfortunately, knowledge, this esoteric knowledge, it's always written out, the most important thing. So Maslow talks about not just the actualized state, but the transcendent state and the peak experience, the perennial psychology. Now, I think there are things like drug sciences. There are places like the psychedelic, centers all over the country, and in Homerton and in Hackney. And look, people are doing these things, and they need integration. They need support. They need non-shaming experiences. Otherwise, it's going to manifest so much dis-ease.
Well, that's also
where can drug sciences, where can psychiatrists, where can we also advocate for the government to say, look, How do we create non-shaming resources? Because we're closing everything down, unfortunately.
Well, yeah, exactly. And that's why this manifesto group, it's not just drug science, it contains experts from a whole range of different areas. We will be becoming really quite active in the new year. So you obviously follow me. I'm on Twitter. I've also gone to this Blue Sky platform as well. So follow me on both, and I'll let you know when you can start to get involved. But there's one other thing you could do, both of you as psychiatrists. You could ask the Royal College of Psychiatrists why they have never given me a platform. So I've just spoken on Saturday at the Polish Psychiatry Conference. The day before, I spoke in Milan. I've been invited to the Italian Psychiatry Conference. I spoke earlier this year in the Spanish Psychiatry Conference, the Portuguese Psychiatry Conference. I've spoken at major conferences in Brazil, Canada, and the USA. I have never been invited to give a talk on psychedelics, on MDMA, at the major British college meeting. I don't know why that is. I suspect it's because there are a lot of people who don't want to hear that story. And I don't think I can nominate myself. But if the two of you would like to still...
Would you like a keynote for that?
I think if you're both members of the Royal College of Psychiatry, why not nominate me to give a keynote speech? I would be very interested to know what they would say. That's one of the reasons I find... I caution you against assuming it's going to be easy. The battles I've had trying to explain to people that cannabis isn't the evil that people like Robin Murray make it out to be. By the way, on Friday afternoon, the president's lecture of the Royal College of Psychiatrists is about drugs and psychiatry. And it's not been given by me. It's been given by Owen Bowden-Jones, who is new chair of the ACMD. He's been specifically asked to talk about cannabis. So it's going to be really important that you listen to that, because he could actually say things which...
We have some powerful people, though. We have some, I think Derek Tracy has I've seen him talk at Karma Cans, and, I think we do have some very powerful psychiatrists.
Well, bring them all together, please, and try to, but certainly...
David, I think if you asked them, they would come. I think if you called out for them, I think they would come.
Well, yes, but I can't call out for the Royal College I find it's quite.
That sounds like the need for a new special interest group of the Royal College of Psychiatrists.
Well, we've tried several times and they've said no. They've said
you reach quota.
You're psychopharmacology. You say no, we're not. We're actually as much psychotherapy. And I think this is the point where there's still a lot of resistance. But
the ENCP gives you a platform, though, David, doesn't it? The ENCP, the European.
Yeah, they're good. That's interesting. Absolutely. But that's pharmacology. And there's more to what we've been talking about, as you all know.
Yeah, absolutely. 100%.
And pharmacology. And that, I'll tell you what I'm worried about. I'll leave this worry with you because I'm going to have to go. I've got another meeting in 2 minutes. But I'm worried that psychiatry is moving away from therapy. That psychiatrists are becoming diagnosticians and prescribers rather than therapists. And I think psychedelic therapy would actually reverse that trend.
David, I think it would. And I think we need to exercise maybe even what those pioneers in the 1960s said, is that, psychomimetic. Like, I think we, no one should be forced to do anything. But I think kind of talking from first principles is a very important part of that wisdom, kind of knowledge, chaperoning, guiding. And look, these are things that are open to abuse. Absolutely. And these are things that leave people in a suggestible state. So the quality of the people guiding. And unfortunately, what seems to be happening in this space is that, look, all human beings are fallible. Now, you've got an important message, but they'll take away the messenger. They'll discredit the messenger to try and rubbish the message. Exactly. And there's obviously been fallen people, within this. And because all human beings are fallible, make mistakes, but the message is very strong. It's very important.
Well, thank you. I'm glad to know that you three are very good echo chambers too for psychiatry, and you, Niamh, as we've talked for pharmacy. We've got to get the pharmacists on board because they control the budgets. But thank you for sharing. Thanks for support.
I'm sure we could get you a talk at the Royal Pharmaceutical Society.
Yeah,
I spoke done it already.
I spoke a couple of weeks ago to the Scottish mental health pharmacists on this topic. I haven't spoken specifically on this topic to the Royal Pharmaceutical Society. So why don't you organise that as well? Yeah,
I'll try and sort that. Very good.
Thank you all. Thank you all very much.
On a positive note, yeah?
Yes.
Good.
Onward and upwards.